She was black, young, and sharply dressed. Yet the moment she stepped into the conference room, the air changed. A senior executive, barely looking up from his seat, gestured to the corner and said she should make sure the coffee was fresh. That was her welcome. No one questioned it. No one corrected him. They all assumed she was the help. And she said nothing. Not because they were right, but because they had no idea who they had just humiliated. What followed wasn't just office politics or corporate coldness. It was something far uglier, something rooted in skin, in youth, in the quiet bias that hides behind titles and polished smiles. She endured the whispers, the exclusion, the invisible barriers they built to keep her out of rooms. She was more qualified to lead than they were to enter. They laughed behind closed doors. They mocked her behind fake kindness. But what none of them knew was that every insult, every dismissal, every casual cruelty was fueling something they couldn't see coming. Because the truth wasn't just inconvenient, it was about to collapse their entire structure. If this is the kind of story that grabs you, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and tell us, what would you have done in her place? Keep watching, because what happens next will flip everything you thought you knew about power, race, and who really runs the room. The city's financial district shimmered beneath the late spring sun as rows of glass and steel skyscrapers reached toward the sky like monuments to ego. Inside one of those towers, on the 39th floor of Peregrine Dynamics, the Monday air was charged with corporate ceremony. The newest intake of interns stood lined up like fresh recruits, tailored suits pressed, notepads tucked beneath arms, and faces trained in eager neutrality. Among them, Zariah Wynn stood motionless, posture straight, hands clasped lightly in front of her. She wore a charcoal blazer, low-heeled black shoes, and a blouse the color of sand. Nothing loud, nothing bold, only clean lines and silence. At 26, she was the youngest in the cohort and the only black woman. Her eyes didn't wander like the others. She had already memorized the floor layout, the senior staff directory, and the org chart that was supposed to be confidential, but had somehow found its way into her inbox the night before. The introductions began. One by one, the intern stepped forward to shake hands with Lowell Vexley, the head of strategic operations, a man whose thin-lipped smile had the permanence of a warning label. Lowell moved down the line, hand outstretched to each new recruit with the same clipped greeting. When he reached Zariah, he didn't offer his hand. Instead, his eyes skimmed her like a document he wasn't sure needed reading. Then he clapped her on the shoulder, turned slightly toward the group, and said in a voice that was just loud enough to carry, "Hope someone here knows how to fix the espresso machine. We've had a bit of trouble lately." His tone was light, joking, but the glance he gave her wasn't. Several heads turned. One in turn chuckled under his breath. Zariah said nothing. She nodded once and moved on. At lunch, she sat near the west windows in the common area, where the sunlight hit the slate tabletops at just the right angle. She laid out her notes on the company's Q2 report, diligently color-coded, cross-referenced with industry benchmarks, and took a quiet sip of coffee. She had barely settled in when a voice drifted in from behind. "This table's actually usually kept for executive use," said Lowell, who had apparently reappeared from nowhere, voice casual but firm. "Best to grab a spot over near the vending wall." She met his eyes and gave a single nod. Then she gathered her folder, her drink, and her quiet, and moved. No argument, no question, no expression. The rest of the day passed under a dim halo of condescension. Her name tag read Z. Wynn, but the department head who conducted the orientation called her young lady throughout the session, and another senior staffer paused at her desk to ask what school she was shadowing from, as if she were a high school visitor. During introductions in a project kickoff meeting, when she started to speak about her thesis work on behavioral risk algorithms, a man named Colby interrupted with a joke about Gen Z kids and their TikTok degrees. The others laughed. Zariah did not. When the day ended, she exited the building last, deliberately. Her rideshare pulled to the curb. She climbed in, stared out the window, and reviewed the audio she had recorded from the all-hands morning huddle. She'd had her phone resting on her notebook, mic active. Not to expose anyone, not yet, but to remember. She played the first 30 seconds. Lowell's voice rang clear. "Let's all welcome our new team," and hope they're ready to learn what real business looks like, especially those who may be used to other environments. She closed the audio file. Her eyes flicked across the skyline, then down to the open memo she had drafted in her head a dozen times. Summary of internal tone-setting behaviors, Week 1. She would not file it. Not yet. But she would keep it. She returned home, boiled water for tea, and sat at the small desk in her one-bedroom apartment downtown. She wrote no journal. She took no notes. Instead, she opened the floor plan of Peregrine Dynamics. She studied the departments. Instead, she opened her laptop, checked the system logs, and resumed working on a data model she hadn't been invited to develop, but had quietly cloned from the firm's internal sandbox server. By 10 a.m., the first subtle maneuver of the day arrived via internal courier, a folder wrapped in bright purple cardboard, its contents labeled Intern Toolkit. Welcome to corporate life. There was no sender, no note, just her name written in block letters with a childlike curve to the Z. Inside were cartoonish infographics on email etiquette, time management, and a printout of office jargon definitions. The irony was surgical. She studied it with a still face, flipping through laminated pages as colleagues walked by and pretended not to glance. She placed the folder in her bottom drawer, not out of shame but preservation. It would have a place in the archive she was building. At noon, she was summoned to a strategy meeting on the 8th floor. The invite had come late, and the seat that remained at the long conference table was directly beneath the humming ceiling vent, where the air conditioning hissed down like judgment. She took it anyway. The other attendees included department heads, project leads, and a few senior consultants flown in from other cities. At the far end of the table, Lowell sat with one arm draped over the back of his chair, speaking with a performative casualness he had clearly practiced. Zariah watched him as he flipped through a presentation booklet with mock interest, while others introduced their project proposals. When it was her turn, she clicked her remote, activated the wall screen, and began her breakdown of predictive volatility in decentralized tech markets. Her tone was level, the numbers crisp, each slide sharpening the contrast between her silence in the office and her fluency in complexity. She had just transitioned into her second model when she noticed Lowell lean toward the man seated beside him. The whisper was low but not discreet. "She's very enthusiastic. I used to be like that, back when I was 19. The room didn't laugh, but it shifted. A few smiles twitched. A few eyes lowered. The power of passive dismissal wasn't in its volume, but in its precision. Zariah finished her presentation with no acknowledgement of the interruption. She thanked the room, gathered her things, and stepped out as the next speaker shuffled forward. No one followed. No one asked questions. No one challenged her data. That, too, was by design. On the elevator ride down, she stood alone. She reviewed her slides on her phone, not because they needed work, but because she needed something to focus on other than the boiling sting in her ribs. The next morning brought more quiet games. Her system login was delayed by 15 minutes due to an IT credential reset. Her meeting invite to the quarterly performance roundtable arrived 5 minutes after it had ended. The cafeteria app glitched when she tried to use the intern code she'd been given. None of these were overt attacks. None of them would warrant a complaint without sounding petty. But each one chipped at her footing, like erosion hiding beneath a marble floor. That Thursday, during a full-staff town hall, the company's VP of Operations praised a data insight model she recognized, down to the formatting, as hers. The credit was given to a team she hadn't been included in. Lowell smiled from the front row as applause scattered through the audience. Zariah clapped once, hand steady, expression unreadable. She said nothing. Later that day, a junior analyst she barely knew approached her by the elevator. His tone was uncertain, eyes flickering toward her badge as if trying to decide how much she deserved to be spoken to. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "I think you're doing really great work." She thanked him with a nod. He hesitated. "I'd keep it light with your ideas around here. You're kind of ahead of the room, you know." He meant it kindly. She filed it under condescension. Friday brought a new humiliation. A department-wide email about professional development was sent to only one recipient on her floor. Attached was a PDF titled Career Foundations, featuring a grinning cartoon owl with a graduation cap and speech bubbles like "Stay curious" and "Teamwork makes the dream work." She didn't forward it. She didn't delete it. She printed it, hole-punched the corners, and slid it into a growing binder at the back of her desk drawer. The binder was nearly full. She took a cab home that evening, the streets pulsing with the weight of early summer heat. As the skyline receded in her rear view, she made a call, brief, emotionless, strategic. "Yes," she said. "Phase 1 is complete. We'll begin consolidating the board data in Q3. No pushback yet. Just camouflage." She hung up. The chair she had adjusted for her posture, the second monitor she had requested through official channels, and even the plant she had brought from home were gone. In their place stood a vacant cubicle with a tape sign that read "Reserved for facilities. Use please do not move equipment." She scanned the floor. No one met her eyes. No one offered an explanation. A junior staffer from IT passed by, paused briefly, then mumbled something about a workspace reassignment approved late Friday. When she asked where she was supposed to go, he handed her a printed map of the building and pointed to a room labeled Storage 2A, Overflow Collaboration. The room was on the far end of the third floor, isolated from her team's primary operations. She walked there silently, heels tapping against the polished concrete, passing the main glass offices that reflected her face like a warning. When she reached the room, the lights inside flickered. The door opened with a mechanical groan. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and leftover carpet glue. 2 old metal desks sat beneath mismatched lamps. One of them had a monitor that hummed but didn't turn on. The fluorescent overhead lights blinked at random intervals, and the only window had been frosted over by age or deliberate intention. Taped to the corner of the desk was a sticky note with her name written in ballpoint ink, as if her presence in the company required physical proof. She sat. She opened her laptop. The Wi-Fi signal was weak. Her calendar didn't sync. She waited. After 20 minutes, she connected to the main server and checked the firm-wide contact directory. Her name no longer linked to any department. Where her title had been, it now read "Unassigned pending role confirmation." Her avatar, once a professional headshot uploaded during onboarding, was replaced with a blank gray silhouette. No team listed, no project group assigned, just static. She opened the chat client and searched for her previous team's thread. The name had changed. She was no longer included. That afternoon, she received a bulk email from HR inviting her to a lunch and learn for emerging talent and junior support staff. The featured topic was how to ask for feedback without sounding defensive. Her RSVP was not optional. At lunch, she walked past the main dining hall and entered the conference room labeled Training Annex. Inside were 5 folding chairs, a tray of cold sandwiches, and a projected slide deck with bullet points in Comic Sans. One of the facilitators handed her a pen with the firm's logo and a worksheet asking her to reflect on how she handled professional redirection. She filled in every question with 3 words, "No comment yet." When she returned to her new desk, the hallway lights were off. No one else had been seated in Storage 2A. She was alone. The sound of her own breathing filled the space between the whir of the HVAC system. She reviewed her log of internal changes and updated the list. Reassigned workspace, calendar blackout, gray profile override, chat exclusion, department tag removed. She recorded each with timestamp, responsible approver, and digital trail. She wasn't gathering revenge. She was documenting decay. That week, she noticed something else. Access to executive-level updates had been revoked. Where she had once been able to view project roadmaps and team status dashboards, she now saw red locks. Access denied. She submitted an IT request. The reply came an hour later. Access limited due to reclassification. Please refer to your direct supervisor. She had no listed supervisor. She followed up. The second response read, "Pending management alignment. Review scheduled next quarter." That night, she returned home and added another section to her internal report, "Artificial role deconstruction via systemic isolation." It was a phrase she had first coined during her research fellowship in organizational sabotage patterns. Now, she had a living example. On Thursday, she attempted to join a team stand-up via the shared conference link. The virtual door blocked her with the message, "Meeting not found." Moments later, she received a separate email from a former peer apologizing and explaining that the meeting series had been moved to a private group for streamlined alignment. She thanked him, copied the headers, and added them to her record. Her former peer's name went into a list she'd labeled likely participants, passive compliance tier. Friday brought a shipment to her desk, a company-branded hoodie, a mouse pad, and a water bottle, sent to celebrate her ongoing growth. The box was addressed to Z, Win temporary assignment track. No one else in the office received one. She held the water bottle in her hand, noting its cheap plastic, the warped print of the company logo, and the welcome card inside that read, "You're learning, you're growing, you're essential." She placed it all back in the box and slid it behind the heater vent. By week's end, she had mapped every procedural slight and visualized them on a wall chart at home. Green for passive blocks, yellow for targeted isolation, red for coded exclusion. She had begun building pattern models, observing how slow deletion worked better than active rejection. Erased visibility, then questioned credibility. The weekly company showcase, an internal networking event meant to highlight innovation across departments, was held on Friday. All employees were instructed to attend, and Zariah received the same formal email invitation along with the rest. On the morning of the event, she arrived early, dressed in a sleek dark navy dress with structured shoulders and minimal jewelry, her hair neatly twisted into a bun at the nape of her neck. She carried a slim presentation folio under her arm, printed with the branding she had designed for a lateral market entry strategy she had developed over the past 2 weeks. As she checked in at the front desk, the receptionist handed her a blank white adhesive name tag and a Sharpie, smiling mechanically and motioning her toward the guest table. Zariah paused, glanced at the name tags prepared for others. Heavyweight rectangles of brushed bronze etched with names and titles in black enamel, and then accepted the sticker silently. She wrote her name in careful block letters and pressed it to her blazer. The contrast between her tag and the others wasn't just visible, it was strategic. It marked her as undefined, unsanctioned, unofficial. A vendor perhaps, or an intern who had wandered too far from the mentorship table. She entered the event hall, walked past the food spread, past groups huddled around branded digital displays, and stood near the far wall, unacknowledged. She watched as Lowell Vexley delivered his introduction on stage, praising the firm's culture of inclusion, innovation, and upward mobility. He gestured toward the crowd as if offering blessings, and when his eyes swept past her, there was no recognition. Not disdain, not surprise, nothing. It was as if she no longer registered as part of the scene. She waited for the showcase portion to begin, then stepped forward and submitted her printed proposal to the central collection table, where department assistants were gathering materials for executive review. Her plan included 3 market entry models, backed by demographic analysis, risk forecasts, and implementation phases adaptable across 3 business units. She had printed them on thick stock paper, bound with transparent covers, and included footnotes with references from the firm's own archives. The assistant took the folder without comment and added it to the stack. Zariah thanked her and stepped back, not expecting gratitude but documenting sequence. 3 days later, the proposal was returned to her desk in a manila envelope without a note. The pages were untouched, the seal unbroken. She sent a follow-up inquiry to the executive review team, requesting confirmation of receipt and feedback. The reply came 2 hours later, not from the executives, but from a junior administrative assistant in brand communications. The message was brief and impersonal. "Thank you for your submission. Unfortunately, the formatting did not meet internal standards and was not escalated for leadership review. Please refer to the communication team's visual guidelines for future design alignment." The document had never been opened. She checked the digital log. The file had been scanned only to verify sender ID, then archived under miscellaneous. No timestamp of engagement. No internal comments. No questions. It was treated like marketing spam. She stared at the screen, then opened the guidelines document referenced in the email. Nowhere did it specify anything relevant to internal strategic proposal formatting. The guideline was for trade show banners. She returned to her report, updated the timeline, and marked the incident as proposal nullification via bureaucratic excuse layering. Later that afternoon, she overheard a conversation outside her assigned room. Two junior analysts were discussing a new initiative to streamline department feedback pipelines. One mentioned that only pre-approved contributors were eligible to submit strategy recommendations moving forward. Zoraya was not on the list. Her ideas were now institutionally irrelevant. Not dismissed, not disputed, just removed from existence. The next day, she tried to attend a cross-functional workshop on competitive intelligence. The security guard at the entrance checked her badge and told her she wasn't listed on the registration sheet. She showed the calendar invite she had received the previous week. The guard apologized but refused entry. A woman in line behind her whispered, "I thought she was part of vendor logistics." Zoraya stepped aside. She didn't argue. She returned to her floor, sat in the storage-adjacent room she now called her office, and filed the rejection into her chart. The erasure was now complete. She no longer had input. She no longer had access. She no longer had classification. And yet, she was still there, still watching, still tracking the shape of the company's internal self-deception. That evening, she compiled her latest observations into a memo, not to submit, but to simulate. If she were advising an external client on how to deconstruct an institution's cultural integrity without triggering legal exposure, she would present exactly this pattern. She would show them how to fade a person's credibility until they forgot they ever had one, how to remove power without resistance, how to turn the human into a ghost. She had followed the correction chain back to a junior coordinator, who assured her it had been an oversight and that she should still attend. The room, large and windowless with triple display monitors and a row of tech assistants managing the AV system, was set for presentations from rising department leads and guests with strategy proposals. Zoraya arrived 5 minutes early, laptop in hand, presentation cued and ready. She wore a fitted dark suit, heels low and polished, and her hair pinned with deliberate precision. She walked to the presenter's table and connected her laptop, ensuring her deck was loaded properly on the projection system. The first few slides appeared on screen: title page, executive summary, and an opening quote from the company's founder about leadership being a matter of character, not legacy. The room was still half empty, and the AV tech gave her a nod before walking off. But 3 minutes before her scheduled time, the screen abruptly flickered and switched to a screensaver showing the firm's default logo on loop. She moved toward the laptop, confused, then saw that the HDMI had been unplugged. One of the tech assistants, young, crew-cut, and chewing gum, returned and shook his head. "Sorry," he said with a shrug, voiced just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This room's reserved for official department presenters. Interns need prior approval. You might want to run this downstairs." She froze, not from shock but calculation. Others turned their heads. A few watched without comment. Her name was still on the printed program, but no one pointed it out. She collected her laptop and papers and walked out without responding. No one followed. No one corrected the mistake. No one offered an apology. Later that day, in the executive elevator bay, she tapped her badge as usual. The scanner blinked green and the doors opened. Already inside stood 3 directors from corporate development, mid-50s, all in slate suits, conversation low and clipped. As she stepped in, their eyes locked on her badge, then on her face. One took a deliberate step back, then said to the others, "Let's wait for the next one." Another laughed softly and replied, "Thought these were access-coded. Guess it's free ride week." The third said nothing but tapped the side of his phone absently, as if already composing a message. Zoraya remained inside as the doors closed. She did not speak. She stared straight ahead, pulse steady, hands loose at her sides. When she reached the 10th floor and exited, she heard one of them mutter, just loud enough to carry, "Back doors are how they always try to get in." That evening, She received an IT alert that her internal badge had been reset to general access only, effective immediately. She forwarded the message to herself and archived it with the subject line, "Public correction via symbolic access revocation." The next morning, her name was missing from the sign-up sheet for Friday's innovation workshop, despite having submitted her abstract weeks earlier. When she emailed to inquire, she received a reply from the coordinator stating that the roster was full and her submission had not matched the firm's priority themes. She opened the internal network and found the list of accepted topics. Her exact phrasing, copied word for word, was now attributed to another team, a senior group with internal sponsorship. She closed the page, opened her own file with timestamps and submission history, and updated the chart. Intellectual property repurposed with strategic realignment. She didn't cry. She didn't storm out. She adjusted. She watched. And she documented. That Friday, during the showcase session she had been removed from, she stood at the back of the room near the catering tables, invisible again. Lowell stood on stage at one point, gesturing toward the crowd and announcing how vital inclusion was to the future of leadership. The irony did not seem to register for anyone. He smiled as he quoted a Harvard Business Review article on workplace equity and gestured broadly, saying, "We don't just talk about representation. We build systems around it." The crowd applauded. Zoraya did not. The following Monday, she arrived to find her workstation equipment had been downgraded. Her second monitor was gone. Her keyboard had been replaced with an older, wired version with missing keys. A sticky note attached read, "Resources temporarily reallocated. Thank you for understanding." There was no signature. Her headphones were also missing. Every employee was required to complete it, and the language in the opening message emphasized that all input would shape leadership succession initiatives. Zoraya received the link like everyone else. She opened it without suspicion until she reached question 3. In your opinion, should leadership roles remain reserved for individuals with at least 10 years of industry tenure? Question 5 followed swiftly. To what extent do you agree that employees under 30 can provide the necessary maturity to lead a billion-dollar enterprise? By question 8, the mask slipped completely. Should initiatives continue that prioritize applicants from historically underrepresented racial groups, even when alternative candidates score higher in traditional performance evaluations? She stared at the screen, each phrasing weighted like a veiled accusation. She understood what this was, not a survey, but a seed. An internal poll structured not to gather opinion, but to create doubt, to legitimize resistance, to normalize the idea that people like her were risks rather than resources. She did not respond to the questions. She documented them. She screenshotted every page, including the tracking script hidden at the bottom of the interface that suggested anonymity was an illusion. She traced the metadata back to a consulting group hired 6 months prior, one known for advising on culture fit calibration. Their founder had once published a paper questioning the ROI of accelerated diversity pipelines. She added their name to her map. 2 days later, she submitted a report to the strategy team regarding expansion opportunities through underutilized verticals. The report had taken 3 weeks of comparative research, model simulation, and market analysis. She printed 5 copies on embossed stock and submitted the file through the internal system using the approved naming protocol. But when she checked the digital archive later that day, her report title had been replaced. What once read Strategic Viability Assessment, Secondary Verticals 2025-2030 now appeared in the system as draft research reference unreviewed content. When she emailed the operations team to confirm the file status, the auto reply thanked her for her training submission and advised that all learning track documents would be reviewed quarterly. She hadn't selected a training track. She hadn't been placed in one, yet the system had moved her there. She reached out to the executive assistant managing the review list, requesting clarification. The response came back brief. We were advised to deprioritize drafts without departmental endorsement. Apologies if this was unclear. Her name had been decoupled from its own work. Later that week, she printed a hard copy of the proposal and attempted to hand-deliver it during a partner lunch briefing. When she arrived, She was stopped by a junior coordinator who smiled politely and asked if she was there to assist catering. She paused, nodded once, and left the document on a side table next to a stack of unused pamphlets. No one picked up. On Friday, a client proposal she had helped shape from behind the scenes was presented in a pitch meeting by someone else. Her name was not mentioned. Her version of the model had been likely altered, color shifted, and reframed as a group contribution. The individual presenting it received applause. She received silence. She sat at the back of the conference room, her seat not listed on the official guest list, and listened as terms she had coined were repeated as if they belonged to someone else. When the meeting ended, one of the partners walked past her without pause and tossed a crumpled napkin onto the floor. She picked it up. She didn't say a word. She never did. That evening, she sat alone in the dim light of her apartment and cataloged every instance in her report. She titled the new entry Reputation Attrition Mechanisms, Passive Discreditation Through Systemic Language Framing. The words felt clinical, detached. They were meant to, because that was the only way to manage it, to dissect what they were doing to her like it was a case study. She no longer spoke about her experiences aloud. There was no one to trust inside the building. A woman in marketing had smiled at her too often and never said hello. A man in compliance had offered help once and never followed up. The silence around her had become contagious. The following Monday, a document appeared in her inbox marked Internal Talent Review for manager eyes only. It had been sent by mistake. She opened it instinctively before realizing what it was. Inside, names were listed beneath coded performance tiers. Her name did not appear. Not in Tier 1, not in Tier 2, not even in the attrition risk section. She was not ranked at all, as if she didn't exist, as if she had never been hired. The erasure was nearly complete, but erasure left fingerprints. Her file tracking system had now grown to over 400 entries, spanning 5 internal directories, 3 performance chains, and multiple chains of command. They had stripped her title, displaced her presence, and drowned her credibility in the murky bureaucracy of a machine built to elevate those who resembled its architects. What they did not know, what they could not have imagined, was that Zariah had never been part of their hiring track. She was not there to climb their ladder. She was not part of their diversity program, nor had she submitted to their mentorship schemes or approval pipelines. She had been placed in the firm through a board-level initiative few inside the company were aware of, her name embedded in legal documents under a pseudonymous trust, a strategic maneuver designed to observe the inner culture of Peregrine Dynamics without disturbing its ecosystem. Her authority had never been granted by HR. It had come from the top, from the chairman himself, the man who had built the company's empire and now sought to ensure its survival by identifying who in his house still carried the rot. On the morning of the quarterly leadership assembly, a mandatory event for senior staff and select observers, Zariah dressed with more care than usual, not to impress, but to signal. She wore black, tailored pants, fitted blouse, leather belt with a brushed steel buckle. Her hair was worn natural, full and unapologetically regal, parted with perfect symmetry. She walked into the auditorium 10 minutes before the scheduled start, ignored the confused glance from the woman at the door, and took a seat in the front row, center aisle. Around her, the murmurs began. A few staff whispered to each other. Some looked at their phones as if to cross-check whether she should be there. Others said nothing, but their eyes narrowed with disbelief. No one stopped her. They didn't know how. At exactly 9 o'clock, the lights dimmed. The company anthem, a soft piano arrangement created for investor meetings, played quietly as the screen above the stage lit up with the company crest. Then the chairman walked in. He was older now, but his presence had not dimmed. Tall, white-haired, always in a 3-piece suit that never wrinkled. His voice low and steady with a kind of resonance that did not require volume to command a room. He stepped onto the stage without notes, without a script. "Good morning," he began, and the room quieted instantly. "Today, I will not be delivering a quarterly update. You already know the numbers. This morning is about direction, about legacy, about leadership, A ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd. People shifted in their chairs, some straightened their ties, others prepared to applaud at the appropriate moments. I have spent the last 18 months preparing for a transition. My time as chairman is nearing its close, and our next chapter requires someone who understands this company not just from its boardroom, but from its bones. The silence grew heavier. He continued, eyes scanning the audience. This person has observed quietly, has been tested without armor, has faced what many of you have refused to acknowledge. And despite every attempt to silence her, she did not break. She learned, she studied, and she remembered. He paused. Your next chief executive officer is already in this room. A single breath held the entire auditorium. Then he said the name, Zariah Wynn. There was no applause, only stillness, only chairs creaking, only eyes turning in unison toward the front row, where Zariah sat without smiling, without blinking, hands resting on her lap like the storm had always been waiting inside them. The chairman continued, as if nothing had fractured. Zariah has been a strategic equity holder in this company for over a year. Her trust, under the name WJ Holdings, currently holds 14% of Peregrine's voting shares. She has served in an observational executive capacity, reporting directly to me under non-disclosure to evaluate operational culture and leadership readiness. What she has endured was not only expected, it was predicted, and every moment of it has been documented. The murmurs returned, faster now, sharper. A few turned pale. Others looked down at their laps. Lowell Vexley, seated 2 rows behind, leaned forward in disbelief, face blank. The chairman pressed on. The failures of this organization to recognize potential when it does not arrive dressed in comfort and familiarity is no longer a flaw. It is a liability. Today that ends. He turned to Zariah and gestured. Please join me on stage. She stood. Not quickly. The silence after the announcement was not just from disbelief. It was fear disguised as contemplation, pride choking on its own assumptions, power recalibrating its hierarchy in real time. She took no pleasure in the discomfort. She needed no satisfaction from the stunned expressions scattered before her. What she required had already been delivered. Clarity. Proof of what happens when merit is ignored in favor of familiarity, when arrogance is mistaken for leadership, and when gatekeeping becomes policy disguised as professionalism. Slowly, she walked to the executive console at the side of the stage. A slim laptop awaited her, closed but active. She lifted the lid, typed a passcode, and pressed her thumb to the biometric sensor. The screen glowed with a pulse of deep blue before the background shifted to a minimalist black and silver interface embossed with her initials. ZW. It was not the employee dashboard. It was the masternode, the root-level access system reserved only for the chief executive. Her login confirmed the final phase of succession. No further approvals needed. No waiting period. No transition team. As she navigated through the system, redirecting permissions and activating new protocols, the overhead projector synced to her screen. Instantly, the company's org chart appeared. Her name, for the first time visible to all, sat at the very top. Every line beneath it extended like a nervous system reorganizing itself around a new heart. The boardroom lights dimmed further, and the room grew colder as the system recompiled in real time. Behind her, the chairman stepped back, hands folded, gaze proud but distant. His work was done. It was Zariah's now. Without speaking, she clicked open a file labeled Cultural Audit. Phase 3, and the screen filled with redacted reports, timelines, behavioral analyses, and full documentation of internal dynamics, including dates, times, and recipients of every microaggression, gatekeeping behavior, and manipulation tactic she had endured. A gasp escaped from someone near the center row. A few people turned to look at one another. Others lowered their eyes. One attempted to leave, but froze when the door locks clicked shut automatically for the security window of the presentation. Let it settle, the chairman murmured softly from the wings. Zariah remained motionless. She wasn't reading from the reports. She wasn't naming names. She didn't have to. Every person in that room who had participated, ignored, enabled, or justified what had happened to her was seeing their actions reflected back at them through metadata and hard evidence. Not accusation, just exposure. There was no anger in her tone when she finally spoke. "You taught me everything I needed to know, and now I'll return the lesson." She closed the report. The projector blinked off. The lights rose. Slowly, she walked down from the stage, the sound of her heels sharp against the tile. No one applauded. No one dared move. She approached Lowell Vexley directly, who had gone pale but remained seated as if his body refused to respond to this new order of reality. Without speaking, she handed him a white envelope sealed with the company's embossed crest. It contained a formal reassignment. He would be moved to a non-operational role, advisory only, pending review by the Internal Ethics Committee. He would retain his pension. He would retain his title on paper, but his authority was revoked. The last line of the letter read, "Effective immediately. You are relieved of all decision-making power until further notice." He took the envelope with a trembling hand, but said nothing. He looked up at her once, expression blank, and then looked away. She did not offer him comfort. She offered him truth. Behind her, several senior leaders exchanged uneasy glances, their seats no longer symbols of status, but potential liabilities. They knew she would not hunt them. That was not her way. But they also knew the time of immunity had passed. Zoraya exited the auditorium without another word. Her steps were steady, unhurried. As she passed through the lobby, the receptionist looked up and for the first time stood. "Ms. Wynn," she said with a voice slightly breathless. "Do you need me to call security?" Zoraya smiled faintly. "No, that won't be necessary." She exited into the sunlight, the automatic doors folding open as if the entire building had finally recognized her. Across the street, black SUVs idled. The legal transition team waited. The press embargo would lift in an hour. Her leadership did not begin with a victory speech or celebratory address. It began with a forensic audit. The first order she signed as CEO commissioned a full independent investigation into the company's recruitment, promotion, and attrition practices over the past 5 years. No one saw it coming. No one thought she would go that far. But she did, and the ripples spread fast. The audit uncovered more than passive oversight. It revealed patterns, deliberate, repeated, measurable discrimination cloaked in vague justifications and policy gray zones. Departments that routinely downgraded internal candidates of color were flagged. Teams that bypassed qualified women in favor of external male hires were exposed. Several projects that had mysteriously failed were traced back to decisions made under false pretenses, masked by budget reshuffling and title manipulation. And at the center of it all stood 3 executive board members whose fingerprints touched every manipulated metric, every suppressed recommendation, every sabotaged opportunity. Their names, well known inside the company, often praised for their charisma and strategic vision, now topped a different list. The special shareholder session was convened within days. The internal legal team, along with external compliance officers, prepared formal charges of breach of ethical duty. Zoraya did not attend the opening of the session. She let the data speak first. A wall of evidence presented through digital exhibits, emails, access logs, approval chains, internal communications laced with condescension or casual bigotry that had gone unchecked for years. Screenshots where candidate rankings were altered post-interview. Memos suggesting certain departments weren't ready for certain kinds of leadership. Recommendations that had been rerouted or quietly buried. Then came the testimonies. Staff who had never spoken up suddenly did. Former interns, former employees, even a few who had once joined in the exclusion, but now realized the extent of the decay. Zoraya had not called them forward. They had come on their own. And that, more than anything, shifted the air. The vote from the board was unanimous. The 3 executives were removed from their positions, stripped of their authority, and referred for regulatory review. Their golden parachutes were frozen pending the findings of the independent inquiry. Their stock options were locked. Their calendars cleared. One by one, they walked out of the boardroom without ceremony, escorted not by security, but by the weight of their own disbelief. They had spent years cultivating untouchable images. Now they were learning what it meant to be made small by the truth. Zariah stepped into the boardroom only after the last of them had exited. She stood in the doorway, not to gloat, but to mark the end of a cycle. "The cleanup has begun," she said simply, and turned to leave. Across the company, the message spread like voltage. No one was above scrutiny. Not anymore. Human Resources, once known for filtering complaints through silence, released a public directive outlining a mandatory retraining program for all management. It was not optional. It included modules on cultural literacy, unconscious bias, systems of exclusion, and policy transparency. Failure to complete the modules would result in withheld bonuses and leadership demotion reviews. The tone was not punitive, it was corrective, firm, undeniable. The company that once whispered compliance now shouted accountability. Internal communication channels lit up with reactions. Some were shocked, some furious, some quietly relieved. Others found themselves examining past actions with discomfort they didn't yet have words for. The firm's stock dipped briefly in the first 48 hours, investors wary of upheaval. But by day 3, after Zariah's measured press release, it rebounded with greater force, as analysts realized the house cleaning wasn't chaos, it was credibility. Clients who had hesitated before now returned. Universities reached out to renew recruitment partnerships. Even competitors issued statements of support, publicly congratulating Peregrine for what one CEO called an overdue standard in corporate repair. Internally, subtle transformations took place. Closed doors were left ajar. Hallway greetings were no longer strained. A few people began printing their own departmental review records, unsure if they'd be next, or hoping they might be. Zariah made no public appearances that week. She operated from the shadows as she always had, now with power legitimized by position rather than secrecy. Her office door remained open, but few dared to enter. Not out of fear, out of reverence, out of awareness that this was no longer the company they used to know. Lowell Vexley, now reassigned to a small advisory role, showed up on the 5th floor each day precisely at 8:30, wearing the same suit, carrying the same leather folder, but with none of the authority he once wielded. 12 months after the boardroom upheaval, Peregrine Dynamics no longer resembled the institution it once was. Hallways that had once echoed with quiet hierarchy now buzzed with cautious optimism. New voices rose in meetings that once echoed the same tired ideas. Programs built around real merit, measurable, visible, and inclusive, replaced pipelines once guarded by familiarity and favoritism. Leadership development was no longer limited to those who knew how to perform belonging. Now, it welcomed those who challenged the system to justify itself. Zariah Wynn did not seek public praise in this new era. Her presence remained steady but unobtrusive, visible mostly through decisions that reached across departments, recalibrated old policies, and lifted silence from the corners of the company's culture. Her time was spent less on celebration and more on construction of systems of access, of belief in what corporate institutions could become if stripped of inherited bias. In that time, something else began to change, not only the structure of the company, but the people within it. Among them was Lowell Vexley, once a man who spoke with casual superiority and moved through offices like the air itself deferred to him. Lowell now arrived at work quietly, usually early, often unnoticed. He no longer held meetings from behind large desks or issued directives from elevated platforms. Instead, he took notes. He sat in listening circles. He asked questions. In the beginning, no one trusted the change. Most assumed it was survival, a strategic rebranding from someone who had learned how to wear humility like a costume. But over time, something deeper emerged. He stopped defending the past. He stopped speaking about what he had intended and started acknowledging what he had caused. When asked why he hadn't resigned, he answered plainly, leaving would have been easier. Staying means learning in full view. He attended every training, not just the mandatory ones. He asked to sit in on junior coaching sessions, not as a supervisor, but as a student. In one session, he was assigned to work with a project assistant 15 years younger who had once been mistaken for office support because of her accent. When she finished presenting her analysis, Lowell stood and applauded quietly, then said to the group, "This is what leadership should have looked like all along." That moment was recorded by someone in the room, and while it was never posted publicly, it was passed around internally like a new kind of artifact, one not of power claimed, but of power released. Months later, at a university forum on workplace evolution, Lowell stepped onto a stage not as keynote, but as testimony. In front of a crowd of students and professionals, he spoke about the architecture of exclusion, not as theory, but as something he had helped build and was now learning to dismantle. "For 18 years, I thought competence meant control," he said. "But it really means courage. Not to lead without challenge, but to lead without certainty you're the smartest voice in the room." His speech was hesitant in parts. He wasn't polished. He fumbled a few lines, but no one doubted its sincerity. He left the stage without applause, just a long moment of silence, thoughtful, heavy, earned. That fall, an email went out from the office of the CEO, announcing the launch of the WIN Initiative, a mentorship foundation focused on developing executive pathways for underrepresented talent in finance, tech, and policy sectors. It would partner with universities, nonprofits, and grassroots organizations. Its mission was to replace the idea of gatekeeping with guided empowerment. The kickoff event took place in a small renovated building downtown, far from the glass towers where Zariah had once been erased. The walls inside were bare brick and natural light, furnished with long tables, whiteboards, and open floor space. There was no hierarchy, only collaboration. On the day of the launch, Zariah arrived early. She spoke to no cameras. She greeted no press. She stood in the back while others told their stories. Young leaders from places where ambition was often mistaken for arrogance, where silence was learned as survival. She clapped quietly when a young woman spoke about being told she was not leadership material, only to later lead a state-level reform initiative. She nodded when a man shared how he had to unlearn apologizing for being heard. When it was her turn, she stepped forward, no script in hand, and said, "The systems that ignore us teach us how to endure. But endurance isn't the goal. Belonging is." She did not speak long. She did not need to. When the event ended, Lowell approached the volunteer table at the front. He signed up for a mentorship slot. He asked to be assigned the first available mentee. "No preferences," he said. "Just someone who's ready." No one questioned his sincerity this time. Zariah saw him from across the room. Their eyes met for one moment. She nodded. He nodded back. That was enough. No forgiveness requested. No permission given. Just two people standing on the opposite ends of transformation, connected not by shame or victory, but by choice. The choice to face what they had been and to decide what they might still become. The company did not erase its history. It published it. It turned it into training. It embedded it into policy. Peregrine became a case study not in scandal, but in resurrection. And at the center of it, not in the spotlight, but in the foundation, stood the woman they had once mistaken for an intern. Zariah never called it redemption. She called it repair, and she built it one truth at a time. The end. If this story moved you, let us know what part hit you the hardest. Was it the quiet buildup, the turning point, or the aftermath? Which character's journey surprised you the most? Tell us where you're watching from and how stories like this resonate with your own experiences. And if you believe more people should see narratives where justice rises through silence, make sure to subscribe and stay with us. We're just getting started.